So we'll get started for our final class on the Haggadah. And after this, you'll be experts. You'll be ready for the Seders that you're going to be leading. And so it'll all be good. Now, I'm just kidding, of course. I mean, one of the great things about Passover is that you can keep finding more and more insights into the Haggadah. There's no end to the ability to add to the text in very personal ways. And so just like the text of the Torah, which we read every year and over and over and over again, and we always find new insights because we are different. The same thing with the Haggadah, we're constantly finding new insights. So I've learned a whole lot from this class just because I've delved deeply into texts that sometimes I'm too familiar with. As I said, I think the first class, that familiarity can sometimes prevent or be a barrier to understanding. So sometimes you've got to look at the text with fresh eyes and see it as an unfamiliar text to try and get out what its meaning is. So I wanted to take a look at some more text from the Haggadah, and we'll bring in text from other places as well and try to get into the minds of rabbis and Jews at different points in history and why these texts may have come in and what they're doing here and what kinds of things we can think about on Passover as we read the Haggadah. So let me share my screen. And this will be, it's part 3 of our class, but it's the third, it's the second source sheet that I created, so that's why I call it part 2 here. So that hopefully give you a little bit better room to see. So if you remember from the last 2 classes, we've kind of looked at the Mishnah, that is the first code of Jewish law on Psachim, that's the section on Passover. And the Mishnah comes from around the 2nd century CE, around 200. It was edited in the land of Israel, and perhaps reflects their practice, the way that they did a Seder. Now, it doesn't have a Haggadah because the Haggadah didn't exist yet, but it gives us a little bit of instructions of what we're supposed to do. So we've read actually this Mishnah before, because this is the Mishnah that tells us about the 4 questions. So I just bring it here just to see where we are. So in the past 2 classes, we've looked at the second cup of wine that's poured, and the questions are asked, why is this night different from all other nights? And then we have 3 questions here, which are different from the ones that we have today. And then we have the beginning of the telling of the story, where we have to begin with shame and conclude with praise. So we're supposed to begin, as it says, Matchil bignut u'mesayem b'shevach. And we looked at what does that mean? What is shame or disgrace? And what would be that beginning for the story, and what would be the praise? And now we've come to the next part of the Seder and then the Haggadah, which is that you begin with shame and conclude with praise, and expounds from a wandering Aramean was my father. That's from Deuteronomy Chapter 6, verse 20, until he completes the whole section. So in the Hebrew, it's V'doresh me'arami oved avi ad she'yigmor kol ha'parasha kulo. So Doresh is a drasha, or a in English, we'd say that's a sermon, essentially, a homily, you could, I guess, call it a interpretation. That word is open to lots of debate. It also is the same root as the word midrash, which is the legendary material the commentary, interpretation by the rabbis. So they're saying you're supposed to do a midrash, a interpretation of a section from the Torah, which is Arami, Oved Avi, until you complete the whole portion, the whole parasha. Now, usually we think of the parasha, when we say parasha today, we think of the 54 parshiot that the Torah is divided into, and each week we do a different Torah portion. Sometimes they're doubled up. But that's what we think of when we think of parsha. Parsha, though, means something a little bit different when the rabbis use it. They don't mean the Torah portion of the week, like this week is Parshat Tzav. They don't mean that. So if that was the case, it would be a very, very long section that you had to read. It would be to the end of the parsha. I'm not even sure where that parsha ends. But when they say parasha here, what they mean is actually, and here you'll see, I have a picture that I took of essentially the Chumash, or this is from the Bible, and it shows you this section, Deuteronomy 6. Actually, this is I think this is it's chapter. It's actually verse 5, so this must be a mistake here. Not 20, but anyway, and it's actually, I think this makes a mistake here. I think it's actually chapter 26, verse 5. So I should probably correct that, but that wasn't. I didn't do this translation. Anyway, it really starts with verse 5, because you see here, Arami Oved Avi. And then when they say to the whole section or the parasha, what they mean is you read all of this until you get to the paragraph break. So a parasha really means this break here. So you see there's a samech, a Hebrew letter samech here, and there's this open space. So the samech is there because this is a particular kind of break called a close break, satum, that starts with the letter samech, rather than an open break where it would go all the way to the end of the paragraph. But anyway, it's a break. So really what they mean is you read it all the way to the end of the paragraph section. So that would be to verse 11. Although what's interesting here is that the Haggadah does not go all the way to verse 11. And so the question is why? The Mishnah says you're supposed to go complete the whole section to the parasha. This is the parasha. It's right here, this blank space. And yet it does not go all the way to the parasha. So one question which we might get to, hopefully we'll get to, is why? Why does the text of the Haggadah that we have, our regular Haggadahs, why doesn't it finish the whole section? Is there something about that section that the Haggadah wants to keep secret from us, that we wouldn't want to maybe talk about on Seder night? Why? And the second is why Deuteronomy Chapter 26, it really should be, I'll make that correction here. Why would we tell the story from chapter 26 of Deuteronomy? Does anybody have a thought? What would be a more logical passage from the Torah that we should expound? What would be, I mean, would you, if you were choosing, okay, we're going to tell the story of the Seder, we're going to tell the story of the Exodus, where would you look? Anybody have a thought? Where would you? Wouldn't you choose the book of Exodus?
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't that seem logical?
Doesn't Deuteronomy have all the rules? I feel like it's nice to start with the rules and regulations before getting into like the meat and potatoes of the conversation, right?
Well, Deuteronomy does have rules, but
this is sort of saying what we got to do. This is how we're going to dip and shake and snack, and it's the rule.
well, yeah, but with the section of Deuteronomy that we read actually doesn't deal with rules. So this is a older translation. It's got the these and the thous, but it says, "And thou shalt speak and say before the Lord thy God, a wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and he became a great nation, great and mighty and populous, and the Egyptians dealt ill with us and afflicted us and laid upon us hard bondage. And we cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction and our toil and our oppression. And the Lord brought us forth from Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, and with great terribleness, with signs and wonders, with wonders." That's where we stop in our Haggadah. But it's really not about rules and regulations. It's the story. And in fact, one of the theories of why we use this section of Deuteronomy and not actually Exodus, particularly Exodus chapter 12, which actually does tell the story of the Exodus, is that it's a short piece here. It's it's what, 5 through 8, so that's 4 verses. That's it, and it gives you the story in 4 verses. It's like it was the ancient version of a tweet. Give it to me in 100. What was it? 160 characters. Now I think they give you more or something, right? 200 and something, 280 characters or something. I don't know, but they said we need something short, and the idea was the Seder that we understand, that we are used to, is a rabbinic invention, but not only for rabbis. So the rabbis created this, but they knew we can't just make this a rabbinic, something that rabbis would want to do, because we're few in number. It's got to be more popular. We got to make it something that regular lay people are going to do. If we tell them you have to do a drash, basically a sermon, a interpretation of the entire chapter of, an entire chapter from Exodus, people are going to tune out. They're going to say, sorry, I'm out, I'm not interested in this. But if you make it something that's short, a short passage that encapsulates it quickly, then you might grab people. And I would say that was pretty good wisdom, because their version of the Haggadah or the Seder won out, and we still are doing it. And actually, if you look at old ancient Haggadahs, thousands of years old, you'll find that this section here, this sermon or midrash on these verses from Deuteronomy are even shorter than what we have in the Haggadah. So it clearly was meant to be something quick. So when we talk about a long Seder where, oh my gosh, can we just get to the food already? Even from the beginning, the rabbis understood you gotta be quick. You gotta do it short and sweet and meaningful. And so they wanted to choose a passage that could do that. And so that's one theory of why they chose from here in the book of Deuteronomy and not from somewhere else in Exodus. And people have pointed out there are other smaller, sort of shorter, capsulated versions of the Exodus too, but they happen to choose this one. Now I'll give you a little bit of context. What's happening here is in Deuteronomy, this is a commandment that the farmer, when they bring their first fruits for the holiday of Shavuot, which is happens 49 days after Passover, so it's a totally different holiday. But during that time, when the farmer would bring their offerings to the temple, they would say this. That's why it says, "And thou shalt speak and say before the Lord thy God, a wandering Aramean was my father." So this is a declaration. First, we call it the first fruits declaration that you're supposed to give when you come to the temple to give your produce. Um, so let's look at what we're supposed to say here. So it's interesting. The scholars have looked at this sermon or exposition or midrash, and actually they found versions of it in old texts, in old collections of midrashim, but not exactly the way we have it. So the way we have it in our Haggadah only appears in our Haggadah. It's not like it was lifted from another collection of midrash, which is very interesting. So people have asked the question, which came first? Did the midrash exist and then it got put into our Haggadah, or was it created for our Haggadah and then later on people put it into collections of midrash? They're not quite sure. There's one theory which I'll explain in a second when we look at this text, that it's really old, and there's another theory that it's actually relatively new or late. So one theory that goes back to 300 BCE, which would be like 2,300 years ago, and one theory that maybe only goes back to, at least the way we have it, to like the 11th century CE, so only about 1,000 years old. So big difference in how old it could possibly be. But it seems like from the Mishnah, if you look here, they didn't have a particular text in mind. They didn't say you should just recite a particular midrash. They said you should make up a midrash. You should make up an interpretation. You should do a what we say in Hebrew, a drash. Give a drash. You should give a sermon about this. You should tell the story. Yeah, Erwin.
I'm following along in the Haggadah by the famed Rabbi Maxwell House.
Okay.
And
Maxwell. Mm-hmm.
Yes, they list Laban as Assyrian rather than a Aramaean. Is that one and the same?
Well, it's a good question of what is meant here. And it's interesting that you say Syrian. So yes, the Aram, the place Aram, is a location in what would be modern day Syria. So that's why they translate it that way.
Thank you.
It's also called Aram Naharaim, the place of Aram between the two rivers. So the rivers would be the Tigris and Euphrates, which is in Iraq, but also they go into Syria as well. So that's why they translate that, probably to give better understanding, because people would say, well, where is Aram? What's an Aramean? Well, if you call it Assyrian, it makes it more understandable. Actually, Erwin, would you like to read this here? And if you want, I guess you can read from the Maxwell House if you want also. But or you can read from the translation that's on the screen here.
I can read from the screen.
Okay.
Go out and learn what Laban the Aramaean sought to do to Yaakov, her father, since Pharaoh only decreed on the males, but Laban sought to uproot the whole. As it is stated in Deuteronomy Chapter 26, verse 5, an Aramaean was destroying my father, and he went down to Egypt, and he resided there with a small number, and became there a nation, great and powerful and numerous.
Okay. So this is the beginning, thank you, of the exposition of the sermon here on these verses. And it's a puzzling verse, Deuteronomy 26:5. An Aramean was destroying my father, or Arami Oved Avi. We're not really sure what it means. An Arami is somebody from Aram, from Syria. Oved means to disappear or perish, something like that. And Avi means my father. So we know what the words mean, but how we should order them and we have two subjects here, or two nouns and one verb. So which is modifying which? So if you look here at this translation, it's an older translation, but it says, a wandering Aramean was my father, which is different from an Aramean was destroying my father. So it's a little unclear what this possibly meant. So in one case up here, the translation is an Aramean, a wandering Aramean was my father. It could refer either to Abraham or to Jacob. So Abraham came from Ur, Babylonia, which is around the same area. It was from Aram, and that's where his family lived. And certainly was one of the places where he stayed before he came to the land of Israel. So it could be referring to Abraham, who wandered and eventually made it to the land of Canaan, and then he went down into Egypt. And it could also be Jacob, because Jacob also lived in Aram for many years, and then eventually also went down into Egypt. So it's not necessarily clear, but that would make sense. Or the translation could be this one, which is a little bit more creative, which is an Aramean was destroying my father. Arami Oved Avi. Aramean was causing my father to be destroyed. In which case it would be referring to Lavan, who attempted to destroy Jacob. So if you recall, I mentioned that there was a scholar who thought this was an old midrash, and the reason, one of the reasons is his interpretation here is, it's very bizarre that we introduce Lavan into the story. The story is about the Israelites going out of Egypt. So what's the point of Lavan here? Well, we have this odd statement that says Lavan was worse than Pharaoh, which also doesn't make sense for the story of Exodus. The story of Exodus is supposed to be, we build up Pharaoh as the great enemy, and yet the Haggadah says that Lavan was worse than Pharaoh. So what could that possibly mean? Why would the Haggadah go out of its way to tell us that Lavan was worse than Pharaoh, when Pharaoh should be the bad guy? I was just doing a religious school earlier today, and we were doing a superhero Haggadah, where the kids could make their own superhero and draw a picture of a superhero that would decorate a Haggadah. And I said to them, you could do a superhero, but you could also do a supervillain. And Pharaoh is he's like super, villain. He's like the ultimate, evil mastermind, because the Egyptians thought he was like a god. So why would the Haggadah make Lavan worse than Pharaoh? Before I give you the answer of this scholar, Louis Finkelstein from the early 20th century, does anybody have a thought of what the Haggadah would be doing here? Making Lavan worse than Pharaoh? Any? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer, but. So Finkelstein, places this in a historical context. So he says that, and it's quite creative, he notes that the Jews in the land of Israel actually lived under the Egyptian, under an Egyptian government for, I think, something like 100 years or so, quite a long time, in the 3rd century BCE. So like 300 to 200 BCE. This was the Ptolemaic Egyptian Empire. So if you remember from world history, Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, but died young, and so his kingdom was divided into really like 3 parts. One was the Macedonian Greek part, where he was originally from. So there was a Greek Ptolemaic kingdom that was carved out of his whole area that he conquered. And then the Seleucid kingdom, which was really like Asia Minor and that area, and Persia. And then there was Egypt, which were under the Ptolemies. And so the land of Israel has always been kind of this crossroad that sometimes is controlled by this group, sometimes that group. And so for part of the time, the land of Israel was under the control of the Ptolemies in Egypt. Then the Ptolemies lost, and there was the Seleucids who came in, and that's where we get Hanukkah, the Antiochus the fourth was a Seleucid king. So, but for a long time, the Jews were under Egyptian rule. So you can imagine, how do you celebrate Passover when you're under Egyptian rule? That maybe you wouldn't want to offend your Egyptian rulers. And so his theory was this goes back to the time of the Ptolemies, when the Jews were under Egyptian rule. And they said, Pharaoh is not so bad. He's not that bad. Lavan was worse. And who was Lavan? Lavan was from Syria. He was an Aramean, which is under the Seleucids. And the Seleucids and the Ptolemies hated each other. I don't know if they hated, they were superpowers. They were always warring against each other. So Finkelstein says, this has a political message here, that Pharaoh, not so bad, because he's part of the Ptolemies. Lavan, much worse, because he was part of the Seleucid Empire. So it's very creative idea, but modern scholars, contemporary scholars, think there's no evidence of this. This is not a political statement here, but rather it comes from another source in the Talmud that has a very similar message. So would somebody like to read, this is from the Babylonian Talmud, from a section called Sota, which is about, Sota is about a woman who is a suspected adulteress. I'm not sure where this text comes into play, but the rabbis often go on to tangents of things. And so for some reason, they're talking about Amram, who was Moses's father. Would somebody like to read?
A sage teaches, Amram, the father of Moses, was the great man of his generation. Once he saw that the wicked Pharaoh said, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Exodus 1:22. He said, we are laboring for nothing by bringing children into the world to be killed. Therefore he arose and divorced his wife. All others who saw this followed his example and arose and divorced their wives. His daughter Miriam said to him, Father, your decree is more harsh for the Jewish people than that of the Pharaoh. As Pharaoh decreed only with regard to the males, but you decreed both on the males and on the females. And now no children will be born. Additionally, Pharaoh decreed to kill them only in this world, but you decreed in this world and in the world to come, as those not born will not enter the world to come. Miriam continued, additionally, concerning Pharaoh the wicked, it is uncertain whether his decree will be fulfilled, and it is uncertain if his decree will not be fulfilled. You are a righteous person, and as such, your decrees will certainly be fulfilled. As it is stated with regard to the righteous, you shall also decree a thing, and it shall be established unto you. Job 22:28. Amram accepted his daughter's words and arose and brought back, for example, remarried his wife, and all others who saw this followed his example and arose and brought back their wives.
Okay. Thank you, Lawrence. So this is a very similar story to that of Lavan. And you'll see here that, we said Pharaoh was not so bad because he only decreed against the males. Remember, he, at the beginning of Exodus, made a decree against the male firstborn children, that they should be, killed. Whereas Lavan, if he had succeeded in defeating Jacob, then there wouldn't be a Jewish people at all. There would be no one. So here it says, as Pharaoh decreed only with regard to the males, but you decreed both the males and on the females. So it's almost the exact same language. you only did, Pharaoh only decreed on the males, Lavan on the whole people. And there's also a connection here because Amram, it sounds a lot like Aramean, Arami. There are a lot of the same sounds, if not letters. Here it's an aleph, and Amram is with an ayin. But Amram and Arami, I think they sound a little bit the same. And so the idea is perhaps the Haggadah is picking up on this theme of the idea of not doing more than Pharaoh. And so you have Miriam, who is sort of teaching her father, although he's the one who is considered the great man of his generation, even though it's Miriam who teaches him the lesson here. But he basically gives up. He says, Pharaoh's going to kill our son anyway, so let's just not even try. And so, he divorced his wife, and everyone else started divorcing their wives. Now, this idea that he's a great man of his generation probably comes in here, that everyone followed in his example, not necessarily, I guess, that he was so wise, because his daughter was able to kind of give him a lesson here. But of course, by not having children at all, you absolutely give Pharaoh a victory. In my family, we like to quote, I'm not sure who it is. I think I guess it's Wayne Gretzky or something, the hockey player, that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So that's kind of a philosophy of life, and we try to say in our family, if you don't try, then you for sure are going to lose. So her example is, well, you may have daughters, and you're preventing those daughters from coming into the world. You're making it even better for Pharaoh. And of course, Pharaoh might kill the children, but at least they would have had a chance to come into the world. You're not even giving them a chance for Olam Haba, to have an afterlife, a future after that. And then, of course, this idea, who knows if Pharaoh's, going to actually be able to do and succeed in what he wants to do, but you're actually making it certain that he's going to succeed. And Amram says, you know what, you're right, and changes his mind. And I just like this midrash here, because I think it gives a different twist to the idea of Lavan. And we should remember that Lavan is a kinsman. Lavan, was Jacob's father-in-law, and he also was part of the family. I guess he was he was also an uncle too. So, I think there's this idea that Pharaoh is not the only enemy that we have. Sometimes the enemy is within, and not even for bad reasons. Amram here in the Talmud, his motivation is not evil. He's not working together with Pharaoh sneakily, and as a co-conspirator. But in a sense, because of his despair, he is working together with Pharaoh to accomplish Pharaoh's mission. And I think there's a nice lesson there that we do that too. We sometimes we aid our enemies, even if it's unwittingly. And sometimes we have to not only work hard to defeat our enemies, but sometimes we have to work hard to win back people that are supposed to be our allies. It could be Lavan, it could be Amram, who's a great man of his generation. That the real effort is often the one that happens within the community, not between the community and those outside of our community. So I really kind of like this idea, which kind of explains something that's very puzzling here, especially because, Lavan, it says here, Lavan sought to uproot the whole people. And I asked the question, when actually did Lavan try to do that? I mean, Lavan wasn't the nicest guy in the world, but he didn't try to kill Jacob. You know, Jacob's children were his grandchildren, and he, at least according to the text, he loved them. You know, he wasn't necessarily the best father-in-law in the world, but I don't know that I would say that he sought to uproot the whole people. So it's a sort of doubly odd text here in the Haggadah, but maybe has a nice deeper meaning. Any thoughts or questions on this section? Yeah. Yeah, Phyllis.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Oh, my question is, didn't Lavan go after Jacob when he was leaving after he married Rachel?
He did.
And he went to get the idols back that she took, if I'm not mistaken. Could that have been almost like an attack on him?
Yeah, well, he definitely went after Jacob and Rachel and Leah and the whole family. He wanted to get his idols back, but he didn't. It doesn't seem like he was trying to kill them or destroy them. So that's where to me, it's just odd. You know, he wasn't. He certainly was not like Pharaoh decreeing that Jacob would be killed. Now, I think there is a text in the Bible, the Torah, that does say Lavan sought to do ill towards Jacob or something, but it's not. There's nothing that says he wanted to kill him. As I said, he wasn't a great guy. I wouldn't say that. It's just to say he wanted to uproot the whole. That's what I don't know. Any other questions or comments on this section? So that's the beginning. That's the introduction to this this drash, this midrash, this sort of sermon. And I just wanted to give you an example here. What's kind of curious about this midrash is that there's not a lot of midrash in it. I mean, or it's not a sort of classic midrash where the rabbis get really creative and add a lot to the story. Most of really what the midrash is taking a verse from Deuteronomy chapter 26, and then taking a phrase from it, a short phrase like and the Egyptians did bad to us. And then finding a text from the book of Exodus that supports this. So it's what I would call sort of like an interbiblical midrash, where you're relating two biblical texts to one another, two texts from the Torah to one another, but there's not really commentary from the rabbis. There's not a whole lot. There is some, but very little of the rabbis saying, and here's what this means. This is what I think. There's a little bit here and there, but mostly it's a verse from Deuteronomy, then a verse usually from Exodus. So it sort of brings the book of Exodus into the story by way of midrash, but in a way that allows the midrash to pick and choose. Like it starts a lot from the first chapter of Exodus, because that's where, you know, the Egyptians did harshly to us. They gave us these difficult labor, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't have a lot of the rabbi's voice in it. So if you look here, I gave an example on this question of, you know, the Egyptians did bad to us. As it is stated, this is the only rabbinic addition here in red, Kamasha Na'amar. And then it's the quote from Exodus chapter 1, verse 10. Let us be wise, this is the Egyptians talking, towards him, lest he multiply, or I think it's maybe Pharaoh talking, lest he multiply, and it will be that when war is called, he too will join with our enemies and fight against us and go up from the land. So this is Pharaoh saying, we have to be wise with these people. They're so numerous that if we were to be invaded by an outside force, then the Israelites might join with our enemies, and that would be bad for us. So what's interesting here is that it's an odd midrash, because usually when you have a midrash, it's the second part of the midrash proves the first part. So the first part is that the Egyptians did bad to us. But the second part of the midrash here doesn't really prove that. It just says that the Egyptians were worried that the Israelites would be, disloyal. But it doesn't sort of prove that the Egyptians, did bad things to the Israelites. Now you could say this was a reason for why they would do bad, but it doesn't really prove it. And one of the theories is that this midrash here is not really a midrash, or it's in form, it's not so much a midrash because it doesn't have a lot of the rabbinic commentary, but rather it's more liturgical. That is more like a prayer or a litany. So where you recite one verse from Deuteronomy, and then you respond with a verse, usually from Exodus, but it could be from other verses, and then back and forth, one verse or a phrase from Deuteronomy, a response from Exodus, and back and forth. It's like a responsive reading almost. And it's not really a midrash, it's more like a prayer, more of a litany, which is a type of prayer. It's like a listing. And so the reason why this verse is here is because it follows in the section of litany. So right before it, maybe quoted from Exodus chapter 1, verse 9. So the verse right before it. So now they were coming to verse 10. It was just in that order, and that back and forth. So, I often in my seders, when we get to this section, I often kind of ditch this text because, it's this litany, and that's not the most exciting thing for, especially when you have kids at your seder. So I try to go back to the Mishnah's idea of, let's just expound this. Let's make it into a creative interpretation, and that's when we start asking questions and talking about the story and telling the story in our own way, rather than kind of focusing on this litany, which is not the most exciting of ways to tell the story. But it makes sense if it's more of a liturgy, of a way of telling the story in this poetic or prayerful way. So I mentioned, though, that that if you recall up here, it says that you start from this verse, Deuteronomy 26:5, and you completed the whole section. But actually, the Haggadah doesn't do that. The Haggadah ends with, and the Lord brought us forth out of Egypt with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, with great terribleness, with signs and with wonders. And you probably recognize this point in the Seder, because this is the part of the 10 plagues. When we get to the 10 plagues, the midrash is over, and we dip our pinky or our
napkin.
Some people use napkin. I was going to say spoon in the wine. I guess there's lots of different traditions, but this is the spilling out of the wine for the 10 plagues. And then we get into Dayenu, and then we're done here. But that's not the end of this section. The section continues on. The declaration of the farmer is not over. He brought us out with great terribleness, with signs, with wonders. And then verse 9, and he hath brought us into this place, and hath given us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now behold, I have brought the first fruits of the land which thou, O Lord, hast given to me. And that's the end of his declaration. And then it says, and then you set it down, and worship before the Lord your God. And then the very last line of this section is, and thou shalt rejoice in all the good which the Lord thy God hath given unto thee and unto thy house, thou and the Levite and the stranger that is in the midst of thee. Again, this is an old translation. So why might the rabbis want to stop and end before, verse 9, 10, and 11? Why not continue? The Mishnah said to go all the way to the end of this section. Why doesn't our Haggadahs do that? What would it be about verse 9 and 10 that would be problematic? What is it that the Haggadah doesn't want us to say? Any thoughts? So one possibility I would offer is that verse 9 talks about bringing us to this place, giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And that's the story of being in the land of Israel, which is integral to the story of the Exodus, because it's not just that we were brought out of Egypt, but we were brought out of Egypt to take us to a particular place, take us to the land of Israel. And yet, on the Seder night, we're supposed to see ourselves as if we have, we ourselves left Egypt. But if you're sitting in Babylonia or Italy or North Africa or China, wherever you might be, it might be a little weird to say verse 9. He has brought us to this place, because we're not there anymore, Vayivi'enu el hamakom hazeh. This place, God really didn't bring us out of Egypt to bring me to, Italy or Lawrenceville, New Jersey. God brought me to this place is supposed to be the land of Israel and the temple. And so if we were to say this, it might feel awkward, or it may feel, inappropriate. And it's, perhaps, this editorial move was made by the people who were not living in the land of Israel, that they didn't want to focus on the land of Israel. They wanted the focus of the Seder to be on leaving Egypt and not coming to the land of Israel. And if you recall from previous classes where we looked at, the question of what was our disgrace, and one idea was that our disgrace was living outside the land of Israel, but not everyone agreed with that. So some felt that the disgrace had nothing to do with that. Disgrace was only about slavery, and so then therefore the high point would be leaving slavery, not going into the land of Israel. And so this section would bring home that point, and so that's why it was not included, because it would focus more of ending our story of redemption in the land of Israel. So perhaps a modern Zionist Haggadah would want to include this section. And actually, if you look at a collection of midrash, this is the Sifrei Devarim, there is a midrash on the continuation. So there was material that they could have added to the Haggadah to really do what the Mishnah says, to fill all the way to the end of the story. And perhaps, I'm not sure if there are Israeli Haggadot or more Zionistic Haggadot that do include these sections, but I just brought it here. We don't need to read the whole thing because it's interesting, but not necessarily germane to the Haggadah, that it picks up the Midrash after the Haggadah ends with verse 8. So this continues verse 9, and he brought us to this place. What is this place? It's the temple. Then the Midrash asks a rhetorical question, but perhaps, or not a rhetorical question, but a sort of a straw man question, but perhaps it refers to the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. The answer is no. And he gave us this land already refers to Eretz Israel. So this place refers to the temple. This land, God gave us this land, that refers to Eretz Israel. How then am I understand? And he brought us to this place as the temple. And he brought us to this place and he gave us this land. As a reward for coming to this place, we were given this land. So it continues, and speaks about this, does a whole midrash on the verses that aren't included in our Haggadah. But one thing that actually is kind of interesting is that the text does say, and you shall rejoice. It says visamachta, you shall rejoice in a time of joy. Bechol tov zeh shir, and you shall rejoice in all the good. This refers to the song of the Levites, and it actually does mention the Levite, you and the Levite. And I think actually that maybe that there was a hint in our Haggadah here of, or I guess maybe we should phrase it that maybe the Mishnah understood that saying that you should expound and you should do a sermon for the whole section. Remember, going all the way to verse 11 here, the end of the parasha, maybe actually would work more logically in the Haggadah, because the last verse says, and thou shalt rejoice in all the good which the Lord hath given thee, and to your house, you and your Levite and the stranger, because this idea of rejoicing, and rejoicing then through song, is really the next part of the Haggadah. You could read it as referring to Hallel. That is the next section of the Haggadah. So when we finish the Magid, the telling of the story, we come to Hallel, which is a central component of the Haggadah and the Seder. And it seems like from a long time ago, this was a central part of the Haggadah. So would somebody like to read this? This is the Book of Jubilees. And the Book of Jubilees is a Second Temple Jewish text that wasn't really preserved by the Jews, but was definitely Jewish text before really the time of the rabbis, but kind of has some things that remind us of the rabbis, but was before their time. So we always try to find out, well, the rabbis have had such a huge impact on Jewish life. What are some texts that aren't rabbinic texts that maybe can shed some light on what Judaism was like, not filtered through the eyes of the rabbis? So the Book of Jubilees is helpful in that way. So would somebody like to read?
I can read.
Yeah, Audrey, thank you.
And all Israel was eating the flesh of the Paschal lamb and drinking the wine, and was lauding and blessing and giving thanks to the Lord God of their fathers, and was ready to go forth from under the yoke of Egypt and from the evil bondage.
Thank you. So if you look here at the Jubilees, it's telling that it's sort of giving you a sense of what the celebration of Passover was before the Seder, because this is not a rabbinic text. So this is referring to what happened on the first Passover, but presumably it's describing what Passover was like in the mind of the author of Jubilees. So you see, what was the celebration? It was eating the Pesach sacrifice. Makes sense. That's what was commanded in the Torah. Drinking wine, which is not mentioned in the Torah, really. The Torah doesn't say that you should drink wine on Passover. It doesn't mention anything about wine. But already in the time of Jubilees, there was wine. So maybe that was even before the rabbi. That wasn't an invention of the rabbis for the Seder night. And then we have this was lauding and blessing and giving thanks to the Lord. So in the Hebrew here, Vayihalu, Vayodu, Vayivarchu. So Vayihalu, they were singing Hallel. They were giving songs of praise. Doesn't tell us what they were saying, but you could interpret that as they were doing Hallel and giving thanks to God. And that's it. So they weren't doing what the rabbis say, which is to tell the story and to expound on halakha and expound on the Torah, but they were doing some things that are essential to, our idea of the Seder, which is the Pesach sacrifice, which we don't do anymore, but drinking wine and doing Hallel, singing praise to God. So it seems to me that Hallel is a essential part of the Seder night, which even predates the time of the rabbis, and is a very essential component to our Seders. And unfortunately, maybe I don't know, how many of us do it. Maybe a neglected part of particularly American Seders, probably partially because the Hallel, you can read it in English, but it sounds kind of funny. It's really meant to be sung, and it's a lot of Hebrew, and it can be challenging to do. To me, it's something that hopefully we can embrace, because it goes back a long ways. It even goes back we even find it in the New Testament. So this is from the book of Mark, and it's describing the Last Supper, what we think of as the Last Supper, which according to Mark took place during Passover. Would somebody like to read this? And by the way, the New Testament is a really good source, another source for us that is a non-rabbinic text, but a Jewish text. And so it helps us to kind of get a sense of what were people doing at the time, not from the mouths of the rabbis, because I don't know if we can always trust the rabbis. I was once in a session that a scholar was teaching, a professor, and he said, his kind of mission was, or for this particular book, was to look at places where rabbis were asked questions, in rabbinic texts. And, he said, like, when you actually look at it, they weren't always asked questions. It was sort of few and far between. The rabbis would give their opinions, but it wasn't quite clear whether the rabbis were listened to or not. So we often try to find out, well, what were people actually doing? So would somebody like to read here from Mark? Any volunteers?
I will.
I'll join at once. Thank you, Judy.
The disciples left, went into the city, and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table eating, he said, "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They were saddened, and one by one they said to him, "Surely you don't mean me." "It is one of the 12, he replied, "one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he said to them. "Truly, I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom
Oops.
of God.
Oops.
Michael.
Did you lose? I can read the last line here.
Yeah.
I don't know what I did.
You lost
I got
it?
it. I got it. Got
You
it.
got
When
it
they
back?
had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
Okay, good job. Thank you.
I wasn't sure we had it all, and I was trying to get rid of the pictures on the bottom.
It's the challenge of using a tablet, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So, but thank you. That was great. So, this is a very important text theologically in Christianity, and of course, inspired, great works of art like The Last Supper by Leonardo. But that's not what interests me here. All of the theological aspects, but really the things that I bolded here, which reflect a lot of familiar aspects of a Seder. So they prepared the Passover, whatever that might mean. If it was they prepared a celebration of the Passover or the sacrifice, it's not clear. But they were reclining at the table, just like we do at our Seder. They were dipping even, which seemed to be a common practice. And the bread here, presumably it was matzah, the unleavened bread. And they took the bread and said a blessing over it, giving thanks for it, broke it like we break our matzahs, give it to everyone. Then they took a cup of wine. Presumably this is what it is. This is certainly what way Christianity has interpreted it. Because when he says, "This is my blood," and then they gave thanks and gave it to them. They drank. They all drank from it, and then after this, they sang a hymn and went out to the Mount of Olives. So it seems here that they were doing Hallel. They were singing a hymn. So again, you have similar practice to the Book of Jubilees. You have eating. You add in some things we recognize like reclining and the bread, and you have wine, just like in the Book of Jubilees, and then you have this hymn, just like in Jubilees, where they were lauding, as it's translated here. So the Hallel is clearly really important, and here is a Mishnah from, again, around 200 CE, that tells us not what happened on Passover night, but it's because it's not from the 10th chapter, it's from the 5th chapter of Psachim, and it's about how they did the sacrifice. So the way they did the sacrifice, according to the Mishnah, is a little different from the way that the Torah describes the sacrifice of Passover. So the Torah says you should make a sacrifice with your family's house, Beit Avot, the house of your fathers. For each house makes its own sacrifice. In the Mishnah, they say, well, actually, they created these chavurot, which are these groups that would make the sacrifice, because presumably not everyone could afford to make your own sacrifice in your household. So households would join together, and they could buy the sheep that would be, sacrificed, and then they would be able to fulfill the mitzvah. And so this describes here, this Mishnah, how one division of, would go out, and then the second would enter. It's telling you kind of like how they would make this happen, because the priest was the one who had to make the sacrifice. So you have to be very efficient. You had to bring all the priests, nobody could get a day off. They were working overtime. All the priests were there. They had maybe like an assembly line where everyone brought their sacrifice. The priest would do the sacrifice, and they would keep the sort of line going. But the key here for our purposes is that they would recite Hallel while they were doing this. And they would repeat it over and over again. So the point is that they were doing, they during the sacrifice, Hallel was an important part of the sacrifice. So it wasn't just slaughtering the animal. You slaughtered the animal while you were reciting Hallel, while you were thanking God, while you were praising God. And that was clearly really important. Now, for those of you who were here I think it was the first class that I did, I had mentioned what was a little bit odd and curious about the 4 questions, which is that the 4 questions presume that a meal has taken place, and yet we ask the questions before we've eaten the meal, because the questions ask, why do we dip twice? Well, we've at that point only dipped once. And why do we, why do we eat matzah and maror? Well, we haven't eaten the matzah and the maror yet. And in the Mishnah, the question originally was, why do we eat roasted meat? Well, we haven't eaten that yet. So I offered the possibility that originally the eating was done first, and then the 4 questions were asked, based on kind of how the Mishnah is worded. But actually, I was on a call with a scholar from Israel, a scholar of Talmud, and his name was Professor Rosenzweig, Yishai Rosenzweig, and somebody asked him a similar question, like, when did they actually eat? And he said, actually, they may have eaten later, the way we do it. And the reason why he assumes that is because of the Mishnah later on. So the Mishnah comes in chapter 10, verse 5. So we've expounded on the verses from Deuteronomy, and then Rabban Gamliel says you have to explain only 3 things: Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, which you might be familiar with from the Haggadah. And then he explains what each of them mean. Okay, and then the Mishnah says, in every generation, a person is obligated to regard himself as if he personally had gone forth from Egypt, because it is said, and you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it's because of that which the Lord did for me when I came forth from Egypt. Therefore, it's our duty to thank, praise, laud, glorify, raise up, beautify, bless, extol, and adore him, who made all these miracles for our fathers and ourselves. He brought us forth from slavery into freedom, from sorrow into joy, from mourning to festivity, from darkness into great light, and from servitude into redemption. And let us say before him, hallelujah. So all of this is in our Haggadahs. It's in, if Erwin is still following along in Rabbi Maxwell House's Haggadah, it's all in there. And it comes right before Hallel. So then the next thing here is Mishnah says, how far does one recite it? That is, how far in the Hallel service do you go? So Beit Shammai says you go to, Psalm 113 verse 9, but Beit Hillel says, no, you go further, all the way to Psalm 114. We follow Beit Hillel. But we do the first part of Hallel, and we actually divide Hallel into 2 parts. There's the Hallel before the meal and the Hallel after the meal. And that comes from the Mishnah, although the Mishnah doesn't mention that anything is eaten here. But and I'll come back to this part here that's in color. But afterward, but after this, we get to the 3rd cup, which is the 3rd cup of the Birkat HaMazon, which is a typical thing that you would say the blessing over the food with a cup of wine. And then you conclude Hallel. So because they did this 3rd cup and they did the blessing over the food, presumably this is when they ate. And so Professor Rosenzweig said, they probably ate their meal right after they did the first part of the Hallel and then before they did the second part. And so therefore Hallel surrounds the meal. And he said, this is because in the temple times, you could say Hallel while you were doing the sacrifice, while you were slaughtering the animal and burning it, etc. So the Hallel accompanied the doing of the sacrifice. But he said, Professor Rosenzweig said, you can't say Hallel while you're eating. now we don't do the sacrifice, so the eating of the meal serves as our symbolic sacrifice, but you can't say Hallel while you're eating because you're eating, So the way that we get around this is we do the first part of Hallel before the meal and the second part after. And I thought that made a lot of sense if we think about why we're doing this Hallel. We're doing this Hallel because it's supposed to be a remembrance of what happened in the temple times. And so therefore it makes sense that we split up Hallel, and the meal is the sort of sandwich, as it were, but of the two parts of Hallel. And I sort of like that idea, and makes a whole lot of sense. But then also I think it's kind of beautiful that it connects us back to this ceremony that was done in temple times. Any thoughts on this or questions or anything about Hallel? So with accompanying Hallel is a blessing. So this we call it now like the blessing over the second cup. Although the question is, are we saying a blessing over the second cup, or are we saying a blessing over Hallel? But Professor Rosenzweig had another really interesting insight here, which is that in the Mishnah there is a disagreement over what is the blessing that we should say at this point. And so Professor Rosenzweig says, if you look at the sort of sequence in the Mishnah, you'll see that we're recalling what happened in the time of the Exodus here. You should tell your son on that day, saying, it's because of that which the Lord did for me when I went out of Egypt. And therefore, we are praising God here for what happened then, for what God did to us in Egypt. God saved us in Egypt. And Rabbi Tarfon says that how should you conclude this section of the Hallel with redemption? He says, very simply, he says, we thank God who redeemed us and redeemed our fathers from Egypt, period. And then it says, and he does not conclude with a blessing. So it's short and sweet. You don't need to conclude with anything more than this, period. You just say, God who redeemed us and redeemed our fathers from Egypt. The whole reason we are here at this Seder night is because of what happened that day in Egypt when God freed us. And that's what we're doing here. That's what the Seder is about. It's about the past, but then it's about, here we are today thinking about the past. But Rabbi Akiva has a different perspective here. Rabbi Akiva says, no, the conclusion of this blessing of redemption is different. It should be different. He says, so may the Lord our God and the God of our fathers bring us to other appointed times and festivals, which come towards us for peace, rejoicing in the rebuilding of your city and glad in your service. And there we will eat of the sacrifices and the psachim, etc., etc. And you conclude the blessing, blessed are you who has redeemed Israel. Now, it should be pointed out that in older manuscripts, it doesn't say, blessed are you who has redeemed Israel. It says, blessed are you who redeems Israel, in the present tense, not the past tense. And so Akiva here is saying it's not about the past. It's not about what happened, thousands of years ago when God brought us out of Egypt. It's about the future. That what we're doing here on the Seder is about looking towards God redeeming us in the future, bringing us to these other festivals, rebuilding the city, so that we can do the sacrifices again in the temple, the way it was before. And so for him, it's about the future. It's not about the past. And what Professor Rosenzweig said, which I think is fascinating, is, Rabbi Akiva is sort of the first person to try and make the Haggadah relevant to modern concerns or contemporary concerns. So, today there's like hundreds of Haggadahs that you can buy. You can buy the social justice Haggadah. You can buy the labor Haggadah. You can buy, somebody just made, I was sending it to my family because they love the show Schitt's Creek, the Schitt's Creek Haggadah. I mean, there's Haggadahs for everything. Back in the 80s, we had Soviet Jewry Haggadahs. We had Haggadahs for the Ethiopian Jews, so they could leave Egypt, leave Ethiopia. You had Holocaust Haggadahs, Haggadahs that were, made during the Holocaust, when people were looking for, to connect their situation to the past redemption. And Rabbi Akiva here is the first one to introduce that idea. And it's, when you think about it, it's actually odd, like Rabbi Tarfon saying, no, the Seder is about remembering this historic event. And period. He says, you do not conclude, you don't add to it. There's no need for any more thanks for God. We are thanking God for what happened in the past. And that's it. That's what we're doing on this day. And Rabbi Tarfon would reply to Rabbi Akiva, you're adding extraneous stuff here, because the whole point is we're saying Hallel, we're thanking God for the amazing thing that God did for us. When Akiva, when you add in asking God for a future redemption, you're undermining the very nature of Hallel, which is to say, thanks God. Now you're adding a request from God, but the whole point of this is that we're supposed to be thanking God and just saying, that was amazing what you did for us, God, in the past. But Akiva is adding something new to the idea that we are not actually fully free. Rabbi Tarfon is saying, no, we were freed, period. Rabbi Akiva is saying, well, we're not exactly free. We have more that God can do for us. And I would say, a lot of us look at Rabbi Akiva and sympathize that we are constantly looking for God's future redemption for us, that there's always something to solve. And the Haggadah has become that, right? That people see the story of the Exodus from Egypt as a model for future redemptions, slavery in the United States and the civil rights movement, absolutely picked up on this story of going from slavery to freedom. And so Akiva really started that, Rabbi Akiva really started that notion, which we still have to today. And we should note, of course, that we've seen this before. If the Haggadah, what the Mishnah presents as two options and as a debate, the Haggadah just brings both, says, why don't we do both? So this is from the Haggadah, and the text says, we bless God who has redeemed us and redeemed our ancestors from Egypt, brought us to this night. And then we add in Rabbi Akiva's blessing. So too, may you bring us in the future. So we combine it. We say, thank you, God, for what you did for us. We're going to sing hallelujah and thank you, but we also want more. We want to be redeemed in the future. And I think it's just it's this really interesting idea that making the Haggadah relevant is not new. It started with Rabbi Akiva, but at the same time, it's also this kind of revolutionary idea that we would take something that happened in the past and that we should just be thankful for, but use it as inspiration for asking God for more and trying to bring more redemption into the world. And this is really the conclusion of the Seder in the Mishnah's sense. So you you've said Hallel, then you eat the which is a sort of a reminder of the sacrifice. You do a blessing, then you do more Hallel, you finish up the Hallel, you thank God, and then that's it. That's the end. And the Mishnah says here, one may not conclude the Pesach meal with an afikomen. If some of them fell asleep, they may eat of the Pesach when they wake from it. That's the Passover sacrifice. If all of them fell asleep, they may not eat. Rabbi Yossi says if they nap, they may eat, but if they fell asleep, they may not eat, etc., etc. But this afikomen, which we think of as a little piece of matzah that's been hidden, was probably some kind of after dinner entertainment, which the rabbis say, no, don't do that. And Professor Rosenzweig, connects this back to the Hallel to say, the night of Seder is an excess. We don't just drink 2 cups of wine, we drink 4 cups of wine. We even the poor person is supposed to eat like a king. We recline as if we were the Romans and as if we were the people in power. And it's a night of excess, but only to a point. It's got to be for serving the purpose of thanking God, and not an afikoman, which was some kind of after dinner dessert or after dinner entertainment, which would be too much in their mind. So that basically that's the end of what the rabbis thought of as the Haggadah. The things that come after the songs that we do and things like that, that's a later addition, which in some sense kind of goes against what the Mishnah says here, which is, ein maftirim achar Pesach afikoman, don't do after dinner entertainment, and yet we kind of do that with the songs Haggadah and all that, which are fun, but in some sense maybe not what the rabbis intended. Yeah, Lynn.
Is that an American tradition that you go
What?
chase after the afikomen and whoever gets it wins the prize or whatever?
I don't think so. I think it goes back further than that. I don't know when that tradition first started.
I mean, that's like the highlight of the end of the Seder, why the kids would stay up, is to go chase after the afikomen.
Yeah, you got to keep the kids entertained, and got to keep them willing to come back for the end of the Seder, right?
That's right.
Which is often, unfortunately, Seders often end after the meal.
And that was also good luck. When you had the afikomen, you had the good luck. Whoever
Absolutely.
got it, you divided it up, and then it was good luck to you.
Right. And it's interesting. I was saying also to the religious school students today that all the songs at the end, are not Pesach songs either. So you could argue to say, well, we're not doing this after dinner entertainment. We're still doing Passover, but all the songs that we love really have nothing to do with Passover. Haggadah has nothing. Doesn't mention Passover. Who knows one? Echad miodea has nothing to do with Passover. Adir hu kilo na'eh. None of these are Passover songs. There are 2 Passover songs that are sung at the end, but I should say that they appear in Haggadahs, but they're really no good tunes for them. And I don't know anyone who actually, people recite them, but I don't know if anyone sings them. So
who tacked them on?
They're much later. They come
right.
The Middle Ages, late Middle Ages,
But if celebrating our freedom, shouldn't we be after we hear the story and now we are free people? We should be celebrating, and part of celebration is singing.
Yeah.
So at the end
absolutely.
of that celebration should be the singing of, since we have learned the story and we were the ones supposedly who went out of Egypt in the Exodus, so now we can celebrate as Miriam did at the other side of the waters,
Right.
the splitting of the Red Sea. bereaved.
and that's why that's the Hallel, that's the singing of
Right.
praise to God. So I think probably, the history of kind of Jewish liturgy is to keep adding, because we don't take away. When the process of editing usually in Jewish text is just add, not to take away. So we added more and more songs, as time went on. But Professor Rosenzweig brings up a good point. We add on later, like at the beginning of the Haggadah, where we say, this is a bread of affliction. Today we are slaves. Tomorrow we'll be free. He says, well, that's really kind of odd. Rabbi Tarfon would have disagreed with that and say, no, we're free now. That's the whole point of this whole exercise we're doing, is that God freed us from Egypt. So why don't add that in? And that is a later addition, actually, into the Haggadah. The Halach Ma'anya, originally didn't mention that we are slaves now and next year we'll be free. That's us adding in the Rabbi Akiva impulse to want to say, yeah, but we're not quite free yet. We're not fully free. We've got more to do. We've got more to go. And I would argue probably most people's understanding of Passover is that way, especially in America in 21st century. Like, it's not just, all right, guys, let's relax and just celebrate life. I feel like most people try to make their seders relevant. And the way you do that is to say, well, where is their Egypt today? Where is there, are we looking for freedom today? Where are the places where we are trying to free people? And it may be, our own brethren, but it could also be others. The Rabbinical Assembly sent out a video about modern day slavery. Rabbi Tarfon probably would have said, what are you adding that into Passover? That's not what it's about. It's about what happened in the past. But Rabbi Akiva would say, absolutely, you should conclude that we've got to free more people. There's still slavery in the world. So I think it's a really interesting dichotomy, which I had, until Professor Rosenzweig had mentioned, I hadn't thought of it that way. That I'd always assumed, we that's what we do as Jews. We are constantly bringing in the idea of the world being broken, and that the whole concept of tikkun olam is that we're supposed to be repairing it. But it's not necessarily a perfect fit for Passover, which really was about, which you could argue is about Hallel and just praising God and thanking God for the miracles that were done for us in the past. So if there are not any other thoughts, I think we'll conclude. I hope that your seders are interesting and joyful and full of praise and thanks. Not
Is there
only
going to be a quiz?
there's no quiz. I mean, you are coming to my seder, so I might quiz you.
I'm taking notes the last 3 sessions.
Okay.
Ben,
Are you actually?
Yeah,
Rabbi, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.